Idiot, can you understand nothing? Will you always try to press everything back into the miserable framework of your old jargon about self and self-sacrifice? That is the old accursed dualism in another form. There is no possible distinction in concrete thought between me and the universe. Insofar as I am the conductor of the central forward pressure of the universe, I am it. Do you see, you timid, scruple-mongering fool? I am the universe. I, Weston, am your god and your devil. I call that force into me completely.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 9, Perelandra, Chapter 7, Weston's New Look. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favorite weekly C.S. Lewis podcast run by three Thulcandrians, Andrew, David, and myself, Matt. This season, we're once again following the adventures of Elwyn Ransom, who this time is exploring Perelandra. And today we're looking at Chapter 7, where we hear about the new worldview of Ransom's nemesis, Professor Weston. Gentlemen, before we dive in, how are you?
Doing well. And it's great to be back with you all. Been a busy week here in the Diocese of Central Florida. We buried one of our bishops who had passed away. He had cancer years ago, and evidently, it's all the treatment and stuff may have caught up with him. It was very sad. He had retired and was assisting in our diocese, and it was a well-beloved bishop. And remarkably, at his funeral on Monday, 26 out of the, about 100 or so bishops in the Episcopal Church showed up for his funeral, including Michael Curry, who had preached at Harry and Meghan's wedding. He was our presider, and I got a blessing from him. And then, unbeknownst to almost everybody, our brand new presiding bishop, which is like our archbishop, kind of kept it on the down low, but he showed up for the service. And he had only just been installed a couple of weeks ago. So we had that funeral, which was moving and sad and resurrectional. As well. And then, of course, the sad news of the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah.
For not dealing well enough with safeguarding issues. My bishop is actually part of the Lambeth Council on Safeguarding, and he and his wife have done a lot of work on sexual abuse, sexual trauma. And so that's been a really sad week in my Episcopal world at large, but great fellowship with some brothers and sisters, and locally good, but globally sad. Oh, and also I have some news. I think by the time this comes out, it may be official. We're not sure. But I have long wanted to participate in the Petoskey C.S. Lewis Conference in Michigan. And I've gotten an initial email from them exploring the possibility about me coming, Krista and me coming, and me giving the keynote, perhaps about till we have faces. So at this point, nothing is firm, but they have asked, I've said yes. And so I'm sure an official announcement will go forth, Lord willing, as soon as we tidy that up. But that's a big score, and I'm really grateful. So if you are in the Michigan area in September, mid to late September next year, love to see you.
Well done, Andrew.
I think I might be able to get permission from the wife to come and see you.
Ah, lovely.
Or I actually might just bring them all with me.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to make a trip back then to Michigan that time.
Twice in successive years, getting the band together. I love it.
Absolutely.
I don't have a whole lot of news. The only thing is I've been invited to speak to an elective class at St. Thomas Aquinas High School, locally here, about C.S. Lewis. So I'm going to get to speak to a small group of nerdy students about C.S. Lewis for 40 minutes, which I'm kind of excited about.
I love it.
It's lovely.
I don't have a lot of news either, other than I came across some great new cutting-edge research that shows that fast walkers have a higher IQ. So I made sure I shared that with my wife as she, notices that I'm always walking way ahead of her.
Okay. Yeah, that would be under the category of something never to do. Hey, I'm rude because you're dumb, is what that says. You may want to rethink that one, Weston.
Andrew, you should have told me this beforehand.
You see, Matt, I'm also naturally a fast walker, but I like to hold my wife's hand as I walk, you see, because I love her so very much.
Wow. Wow. There you go. See,
that's how you do it. That's what years of marriage will do to you.
Yeah. It is amazing though. I just have a hard time not walking fast. By the way, it's not like some sort of big thing. It was like the most minor study, but I thought it was kind of funny.
So Mary Margaret for Christmas needs to get you a weighted vest, slow you down, and get you a little bit buff. You know,
I actually have one. I used to use it for running. I do some medium distance runs with it on me.
Oh, one more quick bit of news. I last year gave a talk on C.S. Lewis to the English Speakers Union, an online talk, and that was lovely. And I have been asked by the local Winter Park, Orlando chapter of the English Speakers Union to kick off their 2025-2026 season in September. So I'll be doing a local event on J.R.R. Tolkien and language. So we'll look at the Oxford English Dictionary that he helped to compose and all that stuff. So nice to have the phone still ringing.
I love it. Well, today I am drinking Compliments of David, maybe. I have an assortment pack now of Best Day Brewing because this stuff is so good. So I'm going to be drinking their West Coast IPA, non-alcoholic. What are you guys drinking?
This is my second of the 6. My first was last week.
Love it.
With a proper pint glass.
That's a thing of beauty.
Yes, although it's only 12 ounces. So.
Matt, you and I are synchronized spiritually, apparently, because I also have the West Coast Hazy IPA.
I love it. All right, gentlemen.
Okay, there we go. Hang on, we got to get this good pouring sound. Ready?
As he pours that, we are going to be toasting new Patreon supporter Vanessa Keck. Now that Andrew has his ready. Gentlemen, let's raise a glass to Vanessa. As we go through this chapter, may she be inspired by the dialect of Ransom and find herself more in tune with the good spirit. Cheers.
Cheers.
Resist the devil and he will flee from you.
Amen. James 4:7.
Man, that tastes like beer again. They've done a good job to making this stuff taste like beer.
Told you.
Should I be watching my mailbox?
Yes, there is a variety pack on its way to you also, Andrew. But I knew that you still had the Kolsch from last time because yours was delayed.
You're very kind.
But if anyone else has any other non-alcoholic beer suggestions, I think this is just going to be the theme, at least for this season while we're recording early in the morning. I have a few more suggestions I saw in Slack, which I will be checking fairly shortly. But let's find the best non-alcoholic beer we can. Best Day Brewing at the moment, really knocking it out of the park.
I've done the Sierra Nevada. I've done Blue Moon. I've done Guinness. I would say the Blue Moon and the Sierra Nevada were not that great. Really lost the beer flavor, to be blunt, and were just kind of like citrusy. Guinness tastes very close to Guinness. So I actually enjoy the Guinness. That was my go-to. But currently Best Day is in the best place.
Okay. Well, it's a vacation day for me, and I was going to pull out my, all of my scotch glasses are downstairs. I was going to have a little shot of Lagavulin this early in the morning, but I'll just stick with the Best Day Brewing for now.
Well, now that I've refreshed my palate with a beer, here is my 100-word summary of Chapter 7. Now fluent in Old Solar, Weston converses with the lady. Ransom and she try to leave to the fixed land, but Weston draws a gun and forces Ransom to stay. Weston explains how he has shifted away from scientism to a form of emergent evolution. He no longer cares about propagating humanity through the stars, but furthering spirituality. He rejects Ransom's distinctions between God and the devil and takes no heed of Ransom's warnings, calling powers into himself and has something like a seizure. As the light fades, Ransom falls asleep nearby. I always expect a round of applause. It's always so difficult to try and compress Perelandrian chapters into just 100 words. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I was literally I wasn't listening to a word you said. I was looking ahead to my initial thoughts to kick off the chapter in my book. So I was like, I clearly read this. I don't need the summary.
Oh, wow.
Well, then let's kick things off. So we begin this chapter with Ransom being almost impressed at Weston's massive egoism. He's standing there on Perelandra just like he owns the place. Not in the slightest bit surprised at Ransom's presence, doesn't really care how. He's doing what Weston does a lot. He's talking. And Ransom snaps out of his own personal train of thought by something very worrying. What is it?
We're presented right away with what you just said, which is very similar. His arrogance has carried true, but the big difference here is he speaks fluent the language, Old Solar. So he's speaking to the lady. And that gives him a fear because that was his main advantage. He describes it as beforehand. He could speak directly and clearly with the people on Out of the Silent Planet. And that he feels like, obviously, he still doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing on this planet. And he feels there goes his only advantage he had. So,
and that's significant because language is so important with Lewis, right? We find it until we have faces. The gods probed me with my own pen, words, words, words. The importance of language, but also in my Northwind studies, I've been doing work this week, in the last few weeks, on Barfield, and how language is the medium of the evolution of consciousness. And that part of why language helps consciousness to evolve, I mean, that comes from Christ being incarnated as the Word. And so as I'm learning about Barfield and the role of language, and I know that he and Lewis talked a lot about it, I think Poetic Diction was dedicated to Lewis, Barfield's great book. It just popped out at me that this is a really huge thing that's gone on. And it makes Ransom rather curious as to how he did it so fast.
Mm-hmm. There's a funny little line where he says that on Malacandra, Weston wasn't very good at the language, partly due to incapacity. He just wasn't very good at languages, but much more from his contempt for the inhabitants. In Weston's mind, we're going to be wiping all of these people out anyway. So, really, what's the point in learning their language?
Yeah.
But notice here, while he's got the capacity, it says very quickly that they couldn't understand each other. And Ransom has been able to understand and have actual conversation. And so the same underlying arrogance is expressing itself despite he having learned the capacity. And it's really that arrogance and egoism that probably makes it that he can't try to see from her side, try to make her understand, try to have a conversation. Like Ransom is very good at doing that because he doesn't come in with that puff chest egoism.
Yeah, no. And what we saw in Out of the Silent Planet is that Ransom had to translate Weston's pidgin Old Solar just in order to communicate. But now we'll see that Ransom has to translate the spiritual concepts. Well, he has to interpret what Weston perfectly says to the lady. We'll see this later, showing why his philosophy is so wrong. And so he's still standing in the place of an interpreter, trying to use his language abilities to preserve and protect these people that are clearly about to be abused.
The two fish that Ransom and the lady rode in on are waiting in the next bay, and the green lady bids them to leave. If you recall, the water is rising, night is nearly upon them, and she's not allowed to stay on the fixed land. Ransom says that Weston isn't going to join them. But when he tries to leave, Weston pulls a revolver on them. And he says that he's happy for the green lady to leave, but he wants Ransom to stay. I thought it was very interesting, Ransom's response. He said that the sudden heat which swept over his body was the only sign by which he knew that he was frightened. His head remained clear. What do you make of that?
We've had the suppressive sense before, where when Ransom told a lie, this inhabited universe kind of really, really disdained him for that, and he had to correct it. And so we've had lying, we've had bloodshed when he scraped his knee, and now we have fear. And fear is a real harbinger of other things. It points to other things. At the end of the Chronicles of Narnia, I think it's Edmund who says, "I just noticed that we can't feel fear anymore. Try it." And none of them could. And so fear to enter this pristine land, especially the fear of bodily murder, spiritually things are going in a certain direction for sure.
It's like it's only so much a biological reality. It's only his bodily response that is alerting him to it. Anyway, Ransom asks Weston if he's going to begin his time on this planet once again with murder, just like he did on Malacandra. And it's kind of funny because the Queen doesn't really understand what's going on. she's seeing the water rising and the night coming on, and so she's very happy to leave. And the text says, Ransom was about to implore her to make good her escape when he realized that no imploring was needed. He'd irrationally supposed that she would understand the situation, but apparently she saw nothing more than two strangers talking about something which she did not at the moment understand. I mean, she's also never seen a revolver, so she doesn't even know what that is.
Well, and remember that she is forbidden from sleeping on the fixed land, but apparently Ransom is not, nor Weston. And so she's obeying Maladil by getting out of town.
What did you guys make of Weston, like, wanting her to leave? Does he know there's a king and he wants her to go there so he can, like, follow her? Does he just want one-on-one with Ransom? Like, why did he want her to leave?
I think it's just because he knows that Weston's bad news and he's trying to protect her. He's not quite sure what his mission is, but it begins to dawn on him, when he recognizes what's going on. And so he's, I think, doing what he can.
And also we see, particularly in this chapter, his opinion of the Green Lady. He refers to her as a native, a savage. Mm-hmm. Much like on Malacandra, he doesn't think much of the native population, even if his philosophical outlook has changed. I also wonder if part of it might be that he's had a metanoia. He himself has had this big change in his life, and he now thinks that he and Ransom are much closer than they were before. So maybe he just wants some time alone with Ransom in the hope to bring him round to Weston's new way of thinking.
That's what I was thinking, because it was Weston that was fine with with her leaving. And I was like, this doesn't make sense.
Well, and some of it is the novelist's move, right? I hadn't noticed it until this reading, and I read it many times, but Lewis is clearly setting the stage for dialogue between the two of them, right? It's like a director moving the lady off stage, and this chapter is not going to be about her.
I did love the exchange between Ransom and the Green Lady right at the end.
Yeah.
He says, "It may be that you and I shall not meet soon again. Greet the king for me if you find him, and speak of me always to Maladil. I stay here."
And then she replies, "We shall meet when Maladil pleases," she answers. "Or if not, some greater good will happen to us instead." It occurs to me that if that these are probably not the worst deathbed words, right? I love that. And "we shall meet again when Maladil pleases, or if not, some greater good will happen to us instead." And I'm thinking about that, specifically as I'm looking for my next job and I'm interviewing here and taking calls there and, considering this one and that one. And it's easy to become quite anxious, but also disobedient to do so. Because if the good that I am looking at doesn't happen, some greater good will happen to me instead. Not a bad attitude.
Well then, left alone with Ransom, Weston begins their conversation by protesting Ransom's description of what happened on Malacandra, the shooting of Hoy, describing it as murder. How does Weston defend himself?
Literally says the creature killed was not a human. And so it kind of goes back to that, his worldview. I mean, well, first of all, he got that classic means can justify an end. Or end can justify a means, sorry.
There you go.
And in his central worldview, it's still a little bit there of like humanity over humans. Obviously, he's willing here to do humanity over anything.
Well, he's not being inhumane if he's killing something that's not human.
Yeah.
Which is so provincial and selfish. What we see here, too, is the kind of beginning of not only the gaslighting of Weston.
Yeah.
But I learned in the recovery community about the pattern of the kind of sick or bent person. And, if you find somebody who's just really troubled and that they're not in it for your good, the pattern is defend, deny, accuse, attack, right? And so, right? Ransom brings this up.
One thing that we missed is he says it was an accident. You don't shoot somebody from a long distance by accident.
Yeah, no, and it was anything but. So defend, I had every right to. He was inhumane. Deny, it wasn't really murder. It was an accident. Accuse, well, you're as terrible as I am and you have faults. And attack, which is, just subverts to name calling. But you can watch the progression with those people in your life that are really, really sick, really, really troubled. And for relatively innocent people to meet people who are manipulative and out for their own gain at anyone's expense. I'm always taken aback by somebody who would be that rude. And my first thought is, oh, what have I done wrong? Or, they must be, and to believe all those answers. But defend, deny, accuse, attack is an interesting pattern to keep in mind. And we certainly see it here with Weston.
Well, within that pattern, accuse, Matt, what does he accuse Ransom of?
Well, he sees two naked individuals there, and he assumes that Ransom must have seduced the lady. I'm literally thinking of the book, the second book in The Name of the Wind, The Wise Man Fears, where he's like in the woods with that mythical character for like a good chunk of the book in like more of a sexual liaison. Anyways, this kind of reminds me of that. It's what they're picturing for whoever's read that book.
Actually, speaking of which, I've just got the first book on Audible. Oh, and in other news, I also got 5 Charles Williams books. I'm doing a deep dive in preparation for Charles Williams Month, so this might mess me up incredibly, but we'll see.
Did you get the novels?
Yes, I did. I went to Serena Higgins' list, and I'm doing them in the exact order that she's recommending.
What does she recommend first? Place of the Lion?
No, that's, I think, second. I think it's not War of the Worlds.
War in Heaven.
Is it War in Heaven?
Yeah.
I definitely had War in the title. I haven't started it yet. That's this weekend.
Yeah, okay. There are some real advantages to starting with War in Heaven, and who am I to disagree with Serena, who's written a marvelous book about the topic. Part of, I think, why she recommends War in Heaven is it's got real Arthurian overtones, but it's also the first of Williams' novels. And so it's not as elegant and artful as some of the later ones. The first one that Lewis read was Place of the Lion, and Place of the Lion almost serves as a model for That Hideous Strength. So I usually start there. That one's written much later. If you read Williams, just hang on for the ride. It's a normal everyday countryside where the supernatural comes breaking in. And once you get a taste for it, there's nothing like it. But
she sold me War in Heaven by saying it's got a plot. And I just looked up the list.
That's true.
It's War in Heaven, Many Dimensions, The Place of the Lion, Greater Trumps, Descent into Hell. So those are the 5 that I'm going to do. But returning to our the accusing of Ransom, Weston does it again. He lies. It's very subtle, but he said that they were embracing. That Ransom and the lady were embracing. They weren't. He added that onto there. It's not just a simple mistake. He is adding something to the situation which was not present. But he does seem very, very confused by nakedness and seems to only associate it with sex.
Right. And, if you think about it, at the end of chapter 6, he turned back, stretched out both arms to bar her way, shouting, "Go back." She was too near. For a second, she was almost in his arms. So they're not even embracing, and he's trying to block her. And so defend, deny, accuse, attack. He puts Ransom on the back foot, denying this thing that he would never have done. And I love his metaphor for this. I don't know where Lewis got this, but I think that's one of his best metaphors ever.
You're talking about the question that Weston asks. He says, "You ask me to believe that you have been living here with that woman under these conditions in a state of sexless innocence?" I've got to admit, the response to this, I had to reread this multiple times before I could actually parse out what he was saying. How would you guys explain it?
So, I mean, first of all, I'll take a step back here. What was interesting was he points out the ridiculousness of like somehow missing the big picture, the forest through the trees. Like you're literally focusing on the Sexless Innocence when you have this incredible beauty of Perelandra. Like to somehow reduce what he's experienced. I mean, he's experienced those water showers, those foods, all different things. It's just incredible, remarkable. And all he's thinking about is the Sexless Innocence. So he uses Niagara Falls to do this. And he describes it as if like you show up to there and you had forgotten water because Niagara Falls didn't immediately give him the idea of making it into cups of tea. And so you have this incredible thing here, but just because you can't like make the connection to putting it into a cup of tea, you're like completely, you're like, well, then Niagara Falls is worthless. I can't have sex. You're not having sex with this person. So this whole thing is like pointless. It's like, dude, you are missing the true depth of what you're experiencing and the beauty and what is happening in this moment. You're just reducing Niagara Falls to its ability to make you a cup of tea. It's kind of how I thought about it.
It's actually a really nuanced passage because around this time we have abolition of man. And one of Lewis's objections is when somebody describes a waterfall, they describe the waterfall as sublime, meaning the effect it has on me. And so the descriptor is an internal reaction rather than an outer, response. And that's what Weston is doing. Weston is turning things inner rather than outer. And it's also similar to what Eustace says. In our world, the sun is only a ball of flaming gas. Even in your world, that's not all it is, right? And so it's utilitarianism, which we find later on in the chapter. And so this idea that, he can think of a beautiful woman as only for sex relegates her, as has so often, so lamentably for so long been done, thinking about her only as she could be used by him. I think it's in the first chapter of Experiment and Criticism, where Lewis talks about receiving a book versus using a book. Or it's in Four Loves, right? Appreciative love. I can appreciate a woman's beauty even though I don't want it for myself. In Experiment and Criticism, he says, that when you use something, it's when you're done with it, you throw it away. And some people use their books like a packet of cigarettes. And once it's finished, it's thrill. And then he famously says, when a man says that he wants a woman, it is usually exactly a woman that he doesn't want. He only wants that part of her apparatus that will serve his need. And that's exactly what's going on in Weston here. And this is one of the earliest occurrences of it. So sorry for this little rant. And I hadn't even noticed it when I first read it. But for goodness sake, he's connecting ideas that he's developing all over his work in the 40s and 50s. And the other thing that I noticed when I first got there was he talks about her being sexless. And it's a negative rather than a positive. And at the beginning of Weight of Glory, he says, if you ask 20 good men today what they thought the highest of virtues, 19 of them would say unselfishness. But many of the great Christians of old would have said love. And what's happening today is that a negative term has been substituted for a positive. And this is of philological importance. The negative ideal is not primarily securing good things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if our abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. And of course, that relates to Great Divorce. Pam, making a tyranny of Michael's memory and, doing great disservice to the family who remained behind. So, so a lot of things are tying up here in this little paragraph.
Ransom tells Weston, begin and end as soon as possible whatever butcheries and robberies you've come here to do. And to his great surprise, Weston puts down his gun and says, Ransom, you do me a great injustice. It's just bizarrely funny that you're holding a guy at gunpoint and then he says that you're a terrible person. It's like, mate, this is me. How dare you?
Yeah.
And here begins their conversation, which takes up pretty much the rest of the chapter. And it begins with Weston making a frank admission. Where is he actually willing to say that he made a mistake?
In the conception of the whole interplanetary problem when they met in Malacandra. He actually says a serious mistake. And so it's a pretty big admission. But yeah, essentially his entire worldview that he had back then, this idea that humans needed to go conquer the other world, that humanity was like the primordial thing that needed to be saved and preserved. We'll kind of hear a little bit later his progression from what is a very initial worldview in life, then to that, then to where he is now.
Once again, because Ransom is of a goodwill and he doesn't really understand how diabolically bad Weston's will is, he kind of takes him at his word and hopes that it's the beginning of a tiny little spark. I think it happens elsewhere as well, but it reminds me of, I think it's the coquette who has a glimmer of something, and George MacDonald in Great Divorce says, oh, we've seen even these faint embers blown into life. The fact that he's admitted that he's wrong, Ransom is always looking for redemption for Weston. And this is true all the way throughout the whole book. He always is hoping for correction and redemption and to rehabilitate Weston and Weston's ideas. the fact that he admits that he's wrong is a big deal for him, and he's hopeful about that, but we'll see what happens to that.
Yeah. Ransom resists the urge to laugh because this might be the first time Weston has actually admitted in his life that he was wrong about something. So he does want to snuff that out. And we'll get on to Weston's new outlook shortly, but there's a temporary break in the conversation as they move all of Weston's camping equipment from his boat inland. And Ransom knows that it's not needed, but he helps anyway, which is rather nice. And we're told that both men sat down and Ransom listened at first with interest, then with amazement, and finally with incredulity. Weston cleared his throat, threw out his chest, and assumed his lecturing manner. And there's a real emphasis on how Ransom's filled with a sense of crazy irrelevance because the whole situation is bizarre. Ransom, he just had his life threatened. Weston is probably losing his ship to the waves at this moment, doesn't seem to care about that. Weston doesn't seem to care why Ransom's there, and they're here on an alien planet having a philosophical conversation like they were in a common room at Cambridge University. And then we're told Ransom felt himself more and more in the presence of a monomaniac. So this is someone who focuses on one thing. Like an actor who cannot think of anything but his celebrity, or a lover who can think of nothing but his mistress. Tense, tedious, and unescapable, the scientist pursued his fixed idea.
Mm-hmm. Can we take a step back and just remind ourselves of a key theme that's still clearly present here, that was present out of the Silent Planet, which was that idea that I can't remember if I was talking to Diana Glyer or Christiana Hale, but that idea that it was Ransom's disposition that allowed him to be able to understand and to approach Perelandra. Came in really not knowing what the heck was going on, but he had an openness, a curiosity. He explored, he listened. He didn't come with these preconceived notions and try to put them on. Well, you're seeing that here again. And you're seeing this in a little bit of microcosm. Notice that arguably Ransom knows far more than Weston, but he just listens. He hears him out. He has a very different disposition than Ransom does, which is Weston, which is to receive, at least at first, understand, which is a very good disposition in life, particularly if you're doing apologetics or trying to convert someone. Listen, receive, understand, then you can start to correct. And that's the exact opposite of Weston, which is why Weston can have go back to the beginning of this, the capacity to understand a language and can't communicate. It's just a disposition.
It's this interesting position that Ransom's in. Just on the previous page, when he puffs out his chest, Weston does, partly from the elaborate air of magnanimity with which the great scientist spoke, magnanimous being generous, and Ransom felt inclined to laugh. And that reminds me of the origin of Screwtape Letters, which happens around now as well. When he hears the Screwtape starts because Lewis and Warney are listening to Hitler, and Warney remarks, even while he's speaking, it's kind of hard not to believe him. And so he's got this admission that he's wrong, this magnanimous air, and at least some kind of humility or even false humility, but the beginning of which, and Ransom has some hope. We'll see what happens to that by the end of the chapter. But yeah, it's a remarkable passage.
Well, in this next section, we get more details on Weston's change in philosophy, his new look, as we're calling it. And this is an echo from Surprised by Joy, where Lewis talks about his own change in philosophy and called it his new look. Which of you would like to try and explain what happened to Weston and how he now views the universe and his place within it?
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the kind of pomposity or pompousness of Weston, trying to explain things on Perelandra.
Well, maybe we should take a step back and give more the progression. So he kind of starts by saying he never gave in to this false ideal of knowledge as an end in itself. He kind of had this utilitarian type of a view, which was he would gain knowledge, he would gain this stuff, but for a utilitarian type of end. I wanted scholarships and income. And generally in that generally recognized position in the world without which a man has no leverage.
He wanted to be an influencer.
Yeah, and honest to goodness, that is what he's saying. And he goes, now when those things were attained, he began to look further to the utility of the human race, which was a lot of out of the Silent Planet, in really trying to focus on that.
Right. So in Malacandra, they were interested in the fact that human race could continue. So they're willing to wipe out all the Malacandrans so that the human life could continue. But now he's taking an even larger view of life itself or spirit or whatever. Keep going.
Can we say too, there's one sentence in here as he's wrapping up the idea of like the human side of things, utility of the human race. He goes, that problem I solved. Like just the arrogance, like I set my mind on this and I solved it, just to make that clear and drop that in there, even though I think I was seriously mistaken.
The key of human destiny was placed in my hands. He goes on to say that he's the greatest scientist in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's elevating beyond the human race to kind of the evolution of consciousness of whom he is he's the embodiment. He's really here perfectly embodying Lewis's own objections to scientism. And Lewis, I think, saw further the implications of where science was going in his day. And so he embodies in Weston the real dangers. I think he says somewhere, the problem about progress is that it never asks where it's progressing to, the goal to which it is progressing, right? Progress means to step forward, and you don't look at the end. Lewis objects to this kind of progressivist scientific approach because he can see where it's going to end. And that's brilliant, how he captures it and literally embodies that in Weston.
Well, this is then the next pivot, though, away from strictly scientism, because he explains that as he was recovering from their near-fatal journey back to Earth, after they were expelled from Malacandra by the Oyasa, that he had time to reflect. It's interesting that he didn't have time to reflect prior to this. But he was thinking about everything that happened, and he particularly focuses on Ransom's objection to Weston's genocidal plans for other planets as they spread humanity through the stars. And he says that he didn't initially see the strength of Ransom's objection because it was presented in a traditional and humanitarian form. These are not ways to appeal to Weston. But he came to see, and this I'm just going to have to read it because there's a few things that he says here. It's like, I don't know how to translate this. He came to see that his excessive devotion to human utility was really based on an unconscious dualism, so a separation of two things. And this dualism was that all my life I had been making a wholly unscientific dichotomy, a separation or antithesis, between man and nature. So he had set these two things up in opposition to each other. But he then becomes involved with biological philosophy, and he says, I saw almost at once that I could admit no break, no discontinuity in the unfolding of the cosmic process. I became a convinced believer in emergent evolution. All is one, the stuff of mind. The unconsciously purposive dynamism is present from the very beginning. And I did a little bit of digging on this, and there's a book called Emergent Evolution that was produced in 1923 by C. Lloyd Morgan. And I had to reread this section multiple times to really try and understand what I thought Weston was talking about. Morgan, he argues that the physical and psychic events that are all part of a single natural order. So everything is natural, but there are both physical and psychic events. And unlike in Darwinism, where everything happens slowly and incrementally, that things evolve unpredictably and suddenly. And I would also call people back to mere Christianity when we were talking about the Elan Vital and life force stuff. This is what he's talking about here.
It's in Barfield too. It's all in Barfield. This kind of evolution of consciousness will turn towards theism. And then remember, in Mere Christianity, he says the next step of evolution has appeared, and that step is Christ. Right? And we will become Christians or little Christs. So we are meant to be like him. And so in this way, Weston, not just going with science, but looking into philosophy, biology, even theology to some extent, and not just looking for the success of the human race, but the success of the life force. He's getting closer to the truth, right? He's not being as selfish, although he is being megalomaniacal. He's closer to what's really true. He despises dualism now, and dualism is a false distinction. The picture of the devil and the angel on our shoulders is a false picture. If we were to do that rightly, we should have a devil on one shoulder and 2 angels on the other, because angels outnumber demons 2-1. And as we see so brilliantly in the Great Divorce, heaven and hell are not opposed. Hell is just a tiny little speck of a crack on the shoreland of heaven in the Great Divorce. Remember when MacDonald takes the little tip of the blade of grass and he points out where the little crack is where they came up on the bus. And so it's not good versus evil. And Lewis says in Great Divorce, evil can't succeed in being evil in the way that good can succeed in being good. And so, yeah, I mean, you have it all here. And Weston's getting closer, but dangerously, in a really dangerous way.
There's a couple of things that stuck out to me in this section, too. It was this whole thing started, he says, because he encountered the intelligent inhabitants in Perelandra. So that broke his worldview, first of all, because he thought it was humanity versus nature. But then what I kind of found interesting is how he's switched so aggressively. Now he says man in himself is nothing. I mean, this guy went from humanity is everything, and we need to push that forward to it's nothing, more or less, and it all becomes about this growing spirituality. I mean, that is everything. And so it is interesting how it all happened right back in Perelandra. He encounters. So to some degree, he is open to his worldview being shifted.
Mm-hmm.
It presented him and he was like, wow, I didn't really think there'd be intelligent life somewhere else.
Well, and remember what Screwtape says, and I'm going to paraphrase it badly. So your man has become chaste. Great. That's wonderful. You'll be punished for allowing your man chastity, but let's tempt him to pride, because we'll always trade the smaller sin for the greater one. And of course, pride is the great sin. So in this kind of humility and admission that he was wrong about man and life and all the rest, that's a moment for Weston to become humble. But what we see is that the opposite happens. And so the enemy is clearly working on Weston in his year or two of contemplation to go, okay, you were wrong about this, and don't worry, I'm going to show you how much better you are. When we get close to virtue, the enemy will always dash in. It's like in Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, when Faust has the ability to do anything. He's got all the power in the world. And he says to Mephistopheles, I want the most beautiful woman in the world and I want to marry her. And Mephistopheles is like, well, you can have the most beautiful woman in the world, but why marry her? Because Mephistopheles is trying to keep him out of church and away from the sacrament, right? Yeah, so all of this is going on here.
So we're told Ransom had heard this sort of thing pretty often before, this whole emergent evolution stuff. And he wondered when his companion was coming to the point. And Weston carries on explaining how his belief in emergent evolution swept away what he understood his duty to mankind to be. And then he makes the shocking admission that he had been wrong to liquidate the Perelandrians. And he says that he now sees his mission is to spread spirituality. That's a very loaded term. Not to spread the human race. He says, I worked first for myself, then for science, then for humanity, but now at last for spirit itself, capital S. And then he tries to wed his new worldview to Weston's. He tries to connect it to Ransom's own religion, namely Christianity. He says that the Spirit is the Holy Spirit. And he says that nothing now divides you and me except a few outworn theological technicalities with which organized religion has unhappily allowed itself to get encrusted. Needless to say, Weston can see through all of these things. It's like, this is my latest philosophical worldview, but let me explain to you why you're wrong. How does Ransom try and push back on this attempt to merge Christianity and Weston's new viewpoint?
Well, he tries to get down to brass tacks. I'm a Christian. I see what we mean by the Holy Ghost is not a blind, inarticulate purposiveness. It's seeing, it's articulate, he speaks, and he's full of purpose, and he's a member of one of the persons of the Holy Trinity. And so what Weston is doing is stripping the Holy Trinity of personality, but then he's gaslighting. He's calling it outworn theological technicalities. Right? The Holy Trinity is an outworn theological technicality. And it's frightening, brilliant and frightening The way that he
Yeah.
does all of this. It's this book really gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah, the gaslighting. This might be, I have to ask Mary Margaret if this was the chapter or if it's one of the ones coming up where she was honestly creeped out when she was listening to the audible version of it because of just the slyness, the deceptiveness, the manipulativeness of it. But you're right here. Literally, Weston goes, we are talking about exactly the same thing. And thankfully, Ransom stays strong. I'm not at all sure that we are.
And that's a pretty mealy-mouthed objection.
Yeah.
He doesn't say, no, blasphemer from hell. He says, I'm not quite sure that we agree. But it's it's strong in as an Anglicism, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say for a Don from the south of England, that's as strident as anyone really gets. Weston makes a big deal about God being spirit, and he seems to connect spirit with freedom and spontaneity. I can't quite see why, but he also sees the whole goal of this cosmic process of becoming of pure spirit. He calls it the final vortex of self-thinking, self-orienting activity. And I think what he's saying is that the universe will become a mind and self-aware. It's not that all of creation was birthed by a mind, pre-existent mind, birthed from the Trinity. No, this is sort of something that this generic force is itself becoming. Am I making sense of what gibberish he's talking?
I had a hard time trying to pinpoint exactly what. I was trying to think through worldviews today, things that we hear. I was thinking of that one book that's like called Homo Deus, which was this argument that evolution is eventually progressing to bring us to become the gods that we think that we espouse. But like, I was having a hard time. So I'll be curious, Andrew, if you have more thoughts. Honestly, I was like, David will be able to articulate this better. So I'm at a loss of words. That David's at a loss of words.
Some of what Ransom or Weston is spewing was current during the day, but some of what Lewis is putting into Weston's mouth is Lewis has thought through the implications. And we'll see this in That Hideous Strength too, #no spoilers. But we'll see that the goal of this kind of looking outwards towards that great force, Lewis is saying, where is that force? And he'll get to the point in just a minute, I think.
The question then turns on whether or not Weston thinks spirit is alive. And he says yes, but it's not a person. And he hates the anthropomorphism that you find in Judaism and Christianity, comparing God to humans and giving God human characteristics, or at least communicating it in that way. But he also sees that there's a problem with making this force too abstract. But he calls it a great inscrutable force, but also a force that can choose its instruments. There's a clear will behind it. And then Weston claims to be being guided by this force.
Yeah.
So then it's the question, well, is he a Jedi or is he a Sith?
And just before that, before he talks about being guided, he says, anthropomorphism is one of the child's diseases of popular religion. What he means is the incarnation, right? Anthropomorphism meaning changing into a man-like form. Like when we think that animals can talk, we're anthropomorphizing them, right? And so when he says that it's a childish disease of popular religion, he's denying one of the main doctrines of all Christianity, that God himself became a man. And so he's looking at it as a spirit instead. And yeah.
And I don't think it is actually just the incarnation, because it's anthropomorphic in a sense to call God our Father. But in that is rooted his goodness and his care for us.
Right.
Rather than Weston's non-personal force.
Right. He's transhuman or post-human. And there are a number, like the English department, as I understand it, of my own graduate university, Rice University, is post-humanist. And we're looking past what humans do. And that's a whole big thing. And I'll leave you to look it up.
Taking a step back before we progress, just to like try to dial this in. Could you say there's a couple other things that are coming to my mind as I more now unpack this in dialogue with you guys versus reading this. Gnosticism sounds a little bit like this. Humans are worthless, spiritual. And then also, if I think of today's more colloquial, the amount of people, particularly like maybe social media influencers that talk about being spiritual, like tapping into some force, manifesting these little crystals, but don't have like necessarily an authoritative framework. It's become kind of this new craze. I wonder if those Gnosticism and that are somewhat related to this. Tapping into, there's something spiritual out there. No idea if it's good or bad. No idea, any sort of morality around it or things, but just something. Would that be very similar to this? And because if that is true, then I'm going to be super curious what the end conclusion of this is, of why that's dangerous. I mean, we all could have a dialogue right now with our current knowledge base of why that's dangerous, but I'm going to be curious what Lewis presents throughout this progression in maybe the next book of the dangers of it and how it could apply to today.
Sure. Throughout theological history, especially throughout the history of Christianity, when Christianity makes forward advances in thinking and its application, the enemy is going to fight back and try to move the line a little bit. Remember, what we find in Screwtape, that if we can get your patient off just a couple of degrees, that's nothing in a life of 80 years, but it's everything in a life that's eternal. And so there are always going to be devilish forces that are trying to skew our thinking away from the true gospel. And that's part of what's happening here. Oh, okay, we're talking about the same Spirit, Holy Spirit, if you will, right? And that's part of what will happen. The Christian musician Keith Green, who died in 1982, one of the points that he made in his own spiritual search was he went to all these different gurus and every religion and every spiritual leader, and all of them, wherever they were, Eastern philosophy, whatever, all of them said that Jesus was a good teacher. And so he finally, because they all agreed on him, came to Jesus. And Jesus never says anybody else is a great moral teacher. He says that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so they're all going to try to get our focus off a little bit, or our understanding off a little bit, so that it can grow larger. And that's part of what Weston is doing right here.
I think you made a really astute observation of the danger of, think of fool's gold versus gold, or brass versus gold. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's dangerous when it looks close, when it looks similar. And here he's getting so similar. So is a bit of a strong word, but he is closing the gap between his old worldview and the proper worldview. And if you stop before closing the gap, the amount of dangers that can be done. In fairness, people point out, look at all of the dangers that have been done in the name of religion. And some of these religions, they have some truth in them, and that's weaponized to the point of deep trouble.
Absolutely.
It's here that Weston claims to be guided by this force. Guided, he said, chosen, guided. I've become conscious that I'm a man set apart. The biblical term for that is holy. Why did I do physics? Yeah. Why did I discover the Western rays? I do want to point out, these weren't named in Malacandra. When he spoke about how the spaceship moved, the less known properties of light, he apparently named them after himself. These were the Western rays. Why did I go to Malacandra? The force, has pushed me on all the time. I'm being guided. I know that I am the greatest scientist the world has ever yet produced. I've been made so for a purpose. It is through me that spirit itself is at this moment pushing on to its goal.
Yeah.
And this talk about spirits really unsettles Ransom. He says, one ought to be careful of this sort of thing. There are spirits and there are spirits, A thing might be a spirit and not good for you. And it actually reveals something of Weston's broken theology. He goes, oh, but you Christians, you worship God because he's a spirit. And Ransom says, no, good heavens, no. Good heavens, no. We worship him because he is wise and good. There's nothing especially fine about him simply being a spirit. The devil is a spirit.
If you we'll obviously get more information as this book progresses. I actually forgot where all of this goes. It was over 10 years ago that I read this. I'm thinking in real time, if I was presented with an individual like this, how you would argue back, at least based on the information that we have right now. He kind of disarms it to some degree. Like, how do you prove to someone who doesn't have a moral framework to test against? Remember how he said there isn't that you can somehow prove, wait, there's an alternative way of looking at this. There could be good spirit and a bad spirit, and you're tapping into the bad spirit. And then he just says, well, no, they're all the same spirit. Like, what in that state on this information, what can you actually do to counter that? Like, how can you prove that there's not one spirit, but there's two spirits, and one of them is more powerful? And in our case, we would look at like the historical evidence for the resurrection, and then try to get to what was the core teachings that came out of that. And if it's true, like those were things that I would do in real time. But if you're speaking here just on this intellectual level, like what would you guys say at this stage that we know? Is there any way to poke a hole in his argument yet? Not drawing on the authority we know.
So I would start by describing and defining, right? And when he gets down to it, and I love that distinction that he makes, there are spirits and there are spirits. And what I wrote before I, reread that passage is spirit or a spirit or the spirit. And so let's be very careful about our terms. And do you use an indefinite article with it? Do you use the definite article? And what do you mean by spirit? I would start by understanding what a vocabulary is. There are certain, religions that use all the same words, but when they say Jesus Christ, it's not who we mean. And when they say God the Father, it's not who we mean. And while the nomenclature is the same, who they mean with their theology underneath is not at all related. And so I would at least start by saying, what do you mean? And let's define those terms.
You made me think in that really well said. The same way I can't think through an actual way to fully prove it yet. You can flip that on the other individual and at least say like, you can't prove these statements yet. You can sort of prove there's some sort of spirits maybe because you do feel that guidance, your experience tells you there's some sort of spirits, but you can at least state maybe there's only one, maybe there's two, maybe there's five, maybe there's 10.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can't fully get to. So like you're saying, define and describe, point out what you can accurately define, what you can't yet. And he's making a bunch of leaps here that just probably can't be made based on his own personal knowledge. So you can kind of just at least, I guess, try to break down the wall of certainty and enter into it like, hey, there could be other ways.
He's co-opting the theological concepts for his own purpose, and he's disregarding the pieces of that theology which are core and essential because they're inconvenient to him. I saw a guy on Reels or something this a couple of weeks ago discussing with a Muslim, and he says, is Jesus a prophet according to Islam? Yes, Jesus is a prophet. And then he started to drill down on what the definition of a prophet is. And if a prophet is somebody who tells the truth and doesn't lie, and Jesus said that he was God, then that starts to trump it. So what do you mean by prophet? And so when they are quick to say, oh, we believe the same thing, what they're trying to do is appropriate the legitimacy of traditional Orthodox Christian faith by borrowing some of the language and the vocabulary, but there's really another agenda involved. And so what are you exactly saying and where are you going with this are two good questions to start with.
See, the real answer is very easy. I would just take him and work through the early chapters of Mere Christianity with him, and we solve all of these problems. But the subject of the devil was just raised, and Weston explains that until recently, because he rejects dualism, he had rejected the distinction between God and the devil entirely. But he now sees that this doublet is a portrait, is a vision of spirit. And he says this: your heaven is a picture of the perfect spirituality ahead. Your hell, a picture of the urge or nisus, which is driving us onto it from behind. Hence the static peace of the one and the fire and the darkness of the other. The next stage of emergent evolution, beckoning us forward, is God. The transcended stage behind, ejecting us, is the devil. And Ransom asks him if he's just using this religious language as a metaphor, as a kind of way of explaining the duty that he feels to spread civilization. And Weston assures him that he's not.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ransom asks him what proof Weston has that he's being guided. This is getting to your point, Matt. What proof could he offer? And Weston points out his improved knowledge of old solar. And it's funny the way he says it, because he says it as though Ransom didn't notice. Oh, they tell me you didn't notice this. And he says, they tell me that you're a philologist. It's amazing the amount of time Weston and Ransom actually had together, and he still didn't know what he did for a job. Typical group of guys. Spend several years together. What does he do? I don't know.
Yeah. Part of that is Weston's own selfishness. Matt Jordan posted in one of the Lewis groups this week came across something in Lewis's Letters, Volume 3, about the fact that he didn't know what J stood for in J.R.R. Tolkien. And Matt said, I find it hard. I find it astounding to think that Lewis would not know his name. But then in Tolkien's letters, you actually find this reference where Tolkien says, we almost kept our Christian names a secret, and so, yeah, there's this kind of, he hasn't paid attention because he hasn't at all been interested. Before we move on, he talks about pairs of opposites, heaven and hell, not opposites, God and the devil, not opposites. Mm-hmm. And then he says, I should have been disposed even a few weeks ago to reject these pairs of doublets as pure mythology. And there he also is making a mistake, because pure mythology, as we see from Planet Narnia, leads us to the truth of God. Mythology is a means of truth, and he's dismissing mythology as just falsehood.
And the more I think about this after asking the question earlier, I think the what proof do you have is a really great question. What Ransom could have done in this state was press a little bit deeper and point out that you've kind of made 25 different assertions here in the last 10-minute dialogue. Let's break them down and see what proof you have for all of them. Because he did present good proof that there's some sort of spirit problem, because he had this experience of just gaining a whole bunch of knowledge. All right. What proof do you have? There's only one. What proof do you have it's good or it's evil? What proof do you have there's not a countering one? What proof do you have? There's so much more here that he's making a bunch of leaps and assumptions that aren't backed by proof. And so you can kind of press in on that with him to some degree. And then if he presses back on our worldview, I'm taking the Christian worldview, really can offer proof, at least probabilistically, and start going through that process.
Weston speaks a lot about surrendering to this life force. And he explains that he's happy to obey this life force, whether it prompts him to murder, betrayal, or lying. Not a great sign. And Ransom sort of sees something here, a possible point of contact between their philosophies where they can sort of reset and start again, namely this idea of commitment. Ransom is clearly heading towards the idea of giving up of the self-aggrandizement, and self-sacrifice. But it gets a very negative reaction from Weston. And this was our quote that began this episode, where he asks, will you always try to press everything back into the miserable framework of your old jargon about self and self-sacrifice?
Mm-hmm.
Comes back to humility.
Yeah. And out of ourself towards others, or as Lewis says around this time, out of ourselves into Christ we must go. And once again, Weston is appropriating from Christianity that which he likes and discarding that which he disdains in order to create something that's very different, that has all the legitimacy and the veneer of Christian truth. It's so dangerous.
And we get to the line where Weston calls this force into himself completely. And then we're told, Then horrible things began happening. A spasm like the proceeding of a deadly vomit twisted Weston's face out of all recognition. As it passed for 1 second, something like the old Weston reappeared. The old Weston staring with eyes of horror and howling, Ransom, Ransom, for Christ's sake, don't let them. Notice who he appeals to, for Christ's sake. And instantly his whole body spun around as if he'd been hit by a revolver bullet, and he fell to the earth and was there rolling at Ransom's feet, slavering and chattering and tearing up the moss by handfuls. Gradually, the convulsions decreased. He lay still, breathing heavily, his eyes open, but without expression. And next season, when we do Surprised by Joy, we will encounter a situation that sounds very similar to this in Lewis's own life. But Ransom tries to give him brandy, but Weston bites off the neck of the bottle, and the glass doesn't come out.
Oh, that's so horrifying.
Ransom takes the opportunity to throw the gun away, but he gets lost on the way back. And then he goes to sleep, muttering to himself, if I lived on Perelandra, Meneldil wouldn't need to forbid this island. I wish I'd never set eyes on it.
Yeah. Do you see, you timid, scruple-mongering fool? I am the universe. I, Weston, am your god and your devil. I call that force into me completely. And that is an echo, I believe, of Othello, Act 1, Scene 3. Where Iago, the evil one, starts kind of setting plans in place. And he invokes the devil. And he says, hell and night must bring this monstrous birth into this world's light. And there's this moment at which Iago invites the devil into him. Scholars can't explain why Iago is so evil, but Christians can. Iago, I think, is demon possessed. He invites this evil force into him, and there's a real similarity to that scene in this. Incidentally, the throwing the revolver in the sea, I couldn't find it in a quick search, but that's one of the first things that Lewis did when World War II broke out, is he went to a bridge and he tossed his service revolver from his sidearm from World War I into the river, because if he ever got taken by the Germans, he didn't want to be armed.
What do you guys make near the very end of this, the one sentence, the last paragraph? When he lay down, he discovered that the solid earth and moss of the fixed land was very much less comfortable than the surfaces to which he had lately been accustomed. Now, the fixed land is the area where the Green Lady is not allowed to spend the night. And coincidentally, it's subpar experience as well. Is Lewis trying to communicate that it was a good rule in teaching that for her own benefit, not just purely obedience, not like it's some great, incredible thing that you're going to miss out on because I just want to test your obedience? Or was this because Ransom's disposition has changed a little bit after encountering conversation with Weston? Like what? Or is this just not meant to be anything, to be honest? And I'm just reading too much into it.
I would just say that his life would have been better had he followed the rules that Maleldil had put forward for the Green Lady.
Mm.
It does sort of skip over the entire question as to whether or not he could do what he was doing. I mean, he was doing this with a gun at his back, but Ransom doesn't seem to think that the sleeping on fixed land is a rule that's going to apply to him. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't seem to even come up in his train of thought. But at least here, he's already saying it would have been better at least if we could have got on to one of the floating islands.
Well, and let me suggest perhaps that that's a plot hole that I think that Lewis and he talks about it more later in the book, but he probably should have established earlier that it's okay for Ransom and Weston being creatures of another world. I mean, they touch on it, but I think that Lewis should probably have kind of made that a little clearer.
Well, in the next chapter, we're going to find out what happens to Weston. And I'm reminded of the line in The Last Battle when Farsight says, "There goes one who has called upon gods he does not believe in. How will it be with him if they have really come?"
Yes, yes. Yeah, doesn't G.K. Chesterton say something about that?
He was another man who also experienced the diabolic.
Yes.
Well, gentlemen, I hear the final call for final drinks. So we want to thank our intern, our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah and Julia. We want to thank our Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier ones, Joanna, Brian, and Meg, Rebecca, Sarah, Mark, Kevin, Aldo, Bud 1, Bud 2, Edgar, James, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Shane, Becca, Kay, Paul, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, Rowdy, and Mary Margaret. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. Is this list getting longer, David?
Of course it is. Wonderful people are helping us.
Yes. Next time, let's start the list at the bottom so that you can hasten up towards the top.
Well, that would be.
I always feel a little sad for Becca, K, Paul, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, James, John, James, Kate. So blessings on all of you. We love you all.
Well, as we're dealing with the diabolic, we'll also be dealing with the upside down. So we will take that list in reverse order next time. And please join us then,
when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.